If you haven't learned your chromatic scale yet, then that's probably the next thing that you should work on. And in this video, I'm going to show you the correct fingerings for the chromatic scale on the clarinet. My name is Josh Gu, and I'm taking my years of experience learning, teaching, and performing, and sharing all of my best clarinet and music tips so you can get more out of your practice, and most importantly, have fun. You can learn more about all of my many resources at QuickStartClarinet.com, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to get notified when I post new videos. Before we get into the fingerings, I want to start with why the chromatic scale is one of my absolute favorite technique exercises, and it's something that I pretty much have my students start working on as soon as they're able to cover all of the holes on the instrument and get down to the low notes. The reason why it's so beneficial is because it covers all of the notes on the instrument. What the chromatic scale is, if you're not familiar, is a scale that consists of all half steps. So no matter what note you start on, you just do half step, half step, half step, half step, half step, moving up. And that covers all of the notes on the instrument. And the reason why that's so valuable and beneficial is because it's the easiest and fastest way to learn all of the notes on the instrument. So if you're really comfortable and confident with your chromatic scale, not just memorizing the finger pattern, but also actually reading those notes as you're going through the music, then in theory, you know all of the notes. So when you come across those notes in your music, you'll know the fingering for it, you'll know how to play it right away. So it's, again, one of my very favorite exercises for really getting into in the early stages of your playing. And in fact, in the next generation clarinet method, I go over the chromatic scale before we even start worrying about tonguing or even crossing the break. The chromatic scale happens very, very early on in sort of the learning process, pretty much, again, as soon as the holes are all covered really well. However, there are some important distinctions with the chromatic scale, especially in terms of using the correct fingerings. And that's another big benefit of the chromatic scale, is it teaches you some alternate fingerings or just some general fingering positions that are really valuable and beneficial to playing in general, even when you're not playing chromatic patterns. But also, chromatic patterns happen so frequently in music that, again, knowing the best fingering and being familiar with it is so super duper valuable. So I actually want to start with a demonstration of how not to do the chromatic scale. So watch my fingers as I play through it, and you'll notice some awkwardness and some issues that arise doing it the wrong way. Those fingering choices may or may not have been inspired by how my wife plays the chromatic scale on the clarinet, but you can see how there's some inefficiencies there. Starting off with the pinky keys, if we try to play all of the pinky keys on just the right hand, then we're gonna have to slide and move around. And again, it didn't sound terrible necessarily, but it was way more cumbersome than it needs to be. So going from E to F, where you're sort of pressing both at the same time, is a unique workaround, but a not necessary workaround. And then going to the F sharp, my wife actually can play the F sharp with the bottom part of her pinky. I think my hands are too big to do that, but if you have to slip and slide, that's something that we generally want to avoid in fingerings anytime. There's very, very rare circumstances where we need to slide our fingers or do something weird like that. So if you ever find yourself sliding or sort of jumping between keys, there's probably a better option. So let's now talk about the correct way to do the pinky keys in the chromatic scale. So first, instead of pressing both with just the right pinky, you're going to want to put your right pinky on the F and C key, and then your left pinky can go on the E and B key. You'll notice when you press the E and B key down, it actually also moves the F and C key. That's also true for F sharp and C sharp, also moves that key. So for both of those, you can actually just leave your right pinky down on this. And that's really beneficial at the start of the chromatic scale, because then we don't have to worry about perfectly timing one pinky going down on one hand while lifting a pinky on the other hand. That's just asking for little flubs and little extra junk in between the notes. So start on low E with both pinkies down, left pinky on the E key, right pinky on the F key. And then you'll notice it's actually really easy to go from F from there, go to F from there. You just have to lift the left pinky off of the E key, and then you're at F. And then it's also really easy to go to F sharp. You just put the left pinky down on the F sharp, then lift both pinkies to G, and then put the right pinky on the G sharp. So for the pinky keys, it's E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp. And the chromatic scale should pretty much do the same fingerings going up as well as going down. So on the way down, you get to G sharp, G, both pinkies on F sharp, lift for F, left pinky down on E for the low E. So that's the pinky keys. Now the next tricky fingering is going from A sharp or B flat to B natural. Being able to flip back and forth cleanly is not a terrible skill to have. There's occasions in music that you'll need to be able to do that and kind of be forced to do that. But in the chromatic scale, there's a great chromatic fingering that is really useful in lots of places and is really worthwhile learning. And that's the forked fingering or the sliver key or the banana key. There's a lot of different names for this. But instead of flipping to B natural, you can keep your finger on the A sharp or the B flat, and then you just add this sliver key with your ring finger, and you get the B natural. This sliver key or banana key or forked fingering has a lot of different names for it, and it also has a lot of different ways to mark it in your music. The way that I do it is a greater than sign with sort of a slash through it, which is kind of what it looks like. If we took the middle finger out, we have sort of the clarinet is the slash, and our fingers kind of make that greater than sign. So that's how I think of that marking. Sometimes that marking is also marked as like a K, which is a very similar kind of image of like the line with the fork. And then there's also other ways of doing it. People will write like sliver key or banana key, or you could do like a B for an abbreviation for banana key or an S for an abbreviation for sliver key. There's all kinds of different ways to mark it in the music, but know that that's what it is. And this fingering is best to use whenever you're having to go to a B natural, B flat or A sharp from B natural, or go to a B natural from A sharp or B flat. Especially if you ever have to trill this, that's so much more effective than having to flip your fingers back and forth, and again, risking getting a lot of extra junk between the notes. There is also one other potential benefit of this note and the forked fingering. Theoretically, it's a harmonic and acoustically better note because the B natural is technically a cross fingering where the air is actually coming out of this hole and then getting like resonated again here. So because that air is coming out before sort of the final resonance point, that's called a cross fingering and isn't acoustically quite as good. Whereas the forked fingering or sliver key is just the air coming out of this hole, and there's no actual sort of crossing where the air has to go over an open hole before it gets to the final sort of resonance point. It doesn't make a huge difference. Like theoretically in the physics of the instrument, the forked fingering is better, and when I'm playing, especially if it's not super fast, I'll generally try to land on the forked fingering more often than the middle finger for both B natural and F sharp. But it doesn't matter a huge amount. It doesn't make that big of a difference, really. So that's the forked fingering. Then we continue on with normal fingerings until we get to the D sharp or E flat. And that's the next sort of problem area. In my super bad example, I did the one-on-one D sharp or E flat. Sometimes students learn this as the default D sharp or E flat, And I have no idea why. Maybe coming from E natural, it seems pretty intuitive and makes sense, especially if you're going down. And maybe there's some method books that teach that as the sort of default fingering, but it's the last choice fingering. The first sort of default that I use actually is the chromatic fingering of the left sliver key. The best option that I would generally teach to students and recommend students learning as the default is the side key D sharp or E flat. The reason for this is the one-on-one fingering. First of all, if your clarinet's slightly out of adjustment, then it's not going to work. Second of all, it's a cross fingering because we sort of have this down and we have holes open before this like final point of resonance. A little bit. It's not quite as much as the B natural, but it's also a little bit different voicing and intonation and doesn't quite have the same sound and doesn't match the notes around it as well as the other more standard D sharp and E flat fingerings. Now, in the chromatic scale, the correct one is the left sliver key. The reason why this is the best fingering in the chromatic scale is because it keeps the motion in the left hand. So as you're going C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, you're just continuing to move the left hand and it's really natural and intuitive. Whereas if you did the right side key, which is a really good fingering, you'd have left pinky, left, get the right hand in, move one finger from the right hand and one finger from the left hand. And whenever we're having to move fingers from both hands at the same time, that greatly increases the chance of coordination issues. So that's why in the chromatic scale, the left sliver key is better. And personally, for A sharp and B flat in the higher register and D sharp and E flat in this register, I always go with the sliver key first as my first choice. There just happens to be a lot of places where it doesn't work, because if I'm going from E flat to any note lower than D or any note above B natural, then I would have to slide. Like if I had to go from C, like E flat to C, then I'd have to sort of slip off of that and hope I landed on the hole. And again, we never want to be slipping and sliding when we're playing. So that's where the right side key would be more effective. Even though we have to coordinate one finger from each hand to coordinate it well, it's worthwhile to not have to slide off of the sliver key. So that's why in general, if you're a very beginner, side key D sharp and E flat as your default. If you're a little more experienced or you just want to be really diligent from the beginning, left sliver key for your default, and then just be aware of if you're ever having to slide off of it, make sure to switch to the right side key instead. The one-on-one fingering pretty much never happens for the low E flat. Occasionally it'll happen for the high B flat. That fingering is kind of a trick fingering. If you're ever doing something really fast, like a B flat major arpeggio in the upper octave, you go from F, B flat to D, then it's kind of useful to use the one-on-one fingering, especially if it's super fast, because then you don't have to get up to the side key and then get to the D. Although personally, I almost never use the one-on-one fingering unless it's maybe like a trill or something that's super duper fast. Even in a fast B flat arpeggio, I just get comfortable enough with getting to the side key and then getting to the D. The last thing that we need to know about the sliver key versus the side key is how to mark it in the music. The way that I like to do it is if I'm using the sliver key, I'll mark that as an L for use the left hand to get to the sliver key. The side key I mark as an R, as in use the right hand to get to the side key. You could also do it as like an S to indicate side key. And then for the one-on-one, I do 1/1 to show like one finger here, one finger here. It's the one-on-one fingering. So that's the D sharp and E flat. And then the last little tricky component that we have is the F sharp or the G flat. For this, if you do F to F sharp and flip back and forth, that can work, and it's not a bad idea to be comfortable with this motion, but there's a better option, especially in the chromatic scale, and that's to use the side key fingering for the F sharp. So you go from thumb F to 2 side keys, for the F sharp, and that's a lot easier than having to flip back and forth. The way that I mark this in the music is with an S for side keys. And the one little caveat with this one is that sometimes for me personally, when I'm going up, I always use the side key, and then sometimes going down, I'll actually use the normal front F sharp fingering and flip back and forth. It was just something that I learned from a teacher once and kind of threw it in there so that I'm comfortable with both options. Again, if you're a beginner, I'd probably just recommend side key both ways. The theory behind it is that when you're coming down, instead of having to land one finger on your left hand with your thumb and get the side keys with your right hand perfectly, and again, coordinating both hands, we can just one finger on the left hand and then flip to the back, so it's still motion in the left hand on the way down. I don't know why this doesn't apply to going up as well, because if we flip going up, then we're also keeping the motion in just the left hand. So it's maybe not the most logical decision, which is why I generally teach just do the side key for both. But if you want to know what I do personally, that's the one sort of subjective fingering choice in the chromatic scale that you can get away with doing either way. But all of the other ones, you should do the way that I said and get comfortable and confident with them that way. So let's see that put all together now. I'm going to play a chromatic scale from the low E up to the B flat. Really nice and slow. I also might move my fingers a little bit more dramatically and a little bit more than we normally would so that you can really see my fingerings. Don't do that when you're actually practicing it, but just for sort of demonstration purposes so you can really see where those fingers are going for the correct chromatic fingerings. So that's your correct chromatic fingerings for the lower register. As you get into the higher register, it's exactly the same. You just add the register key, of course, starting at B. Same exact finger patterns, F sharp with the sliver key, same pinky patterns, B flat or A sharp with the sliver key on the left hand as well. When you get to C sharp, you don't have to worry about a chromatic fingering because that's where you start getting into the altissimo register, so you just do a normal C sharp rather than the side keys or a chromatic fingering. That side key chromatic fingering for C sharp, or not chromatic fingering, you wouldn't actually use it, but the side key chromatic fingering for low F sharp with the register key does give you C sharp and can be useful for trilling, but in the chromatic scale, you would just use the normal C sharp fingering and continue on up from there. I'll give one other little bonus advanced tip for the chromatic fingering. In the altissimo, the fingering is actually very, very similar to the lowest register or the clarion register as well. Thinking about the clarion register, we have E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A. If we do those same fingerings, but just take off the first finger, then we're at C sharp, and then D, but we have to add the pinky key, D sharp, E, F, F sharp. And you can see how it's the same chromatic fingering pattern as E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp. Hopefully you can see how those are the same pattern. So if you're struggling with your altissimo fingerings, that can be also a great benefit of practicing the chromatic scale. Definitely by the time you're working on the altissimo, you should be very comfortable with the chromatic scale. So it'll be a great way to sort of apply that chromatic scale knowledge to the upper register in the altissimo of the clarinet. All right, I hope that that is helpful, that you now know the correct chromatic scale fingerings to be using. I hope that you practice your chromatic scale regularly, whether or not you've learned it before. If it's your first time learning it, then stick to that lower register, but get those correct fingerings down and do it reading along with the music, because then you'll be able to associate the notes on the page with the actual fingering patterns as well. And before you know it, you'll be familiar with and have a good understanding of all of the notes on the clarinet. So I hope that this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in another video. And last but not least, a huge heartfelt thank you to the Dennersons. This is like the QuickStart Clarinet family who supports the channel and helps to make everything that I do possible. If you would like to support the channel and get some awesome rewards in return, where we can work one-on-one over video and you can have my full support moving forward on your clarinet journey, then go to quickstartclarinet.com/supporter.